The age began with a distant will and a deliberate light. It did not flare, it gathered. A starless thought moved across an old sky, and a law descended that would call itself golden. The law took shape as runes that were not letters but principles, and those principles settled within a beast that was less a creature than a vessel of intention. The vessel entered the world like a falling oath and folded itself into a tree whose boughs were a covenant. The Erd tree rose. Its light sorted what lived from what would be allowed to die. Under that canopy a chosen vessel would be named, for the law was not only code but kinship, and kinship would be written through a family that could hold the weight of an age. He was called the Greater Will, though he was not a person the way a mother or a monarch is a person. He was an order giver at a distance, speaking through envoys with many fingers who did not speak in breath. They advised by gesture and they judged by contact. They brought guidance to a goddess named Marika, whose name would outlive temples and whose choices would outlast cities. The Erd tree stood as her visible crown and as her visible vow. To hold it upright, she would remove a portion of death from the world and bind it away with a guardian who never slept. The piece of death was called a rune. The guardian was called Malekith. The law was made colder, which allowed it to endure. A consort was raised beside Marika, a first champion named Godfrey. He wore strength like a quiet garment. He led campaigns that did not read as hunger but as pruning. He put the lands into lines that the law could measure. He fathered children whose blood would become the measure of power and the currency of claims. When his wars had taught the world enough about obedience, the light decided that peace would now teach it about distance. Godfrey was uncrowned without spectacle, and the mantle of exile fell like a final instruction. He left the capital and became a story parents used to anchor restless children. He would return only as a memory that still held a sword. Marika then cleaved and did not cleave. A red-haired champion named Radahn came forward as consort and came forward as reflection. He brought a different discipline from a learned north, and he brought with him a house of moons whose queen had a mind like a precise tide. These were not mere alliances. They were two shores of the same continent. Some records suggest that Marika and Radahn were a mystery in one body taller than doctrine, while other records hold them to be two rulers who shared a throne and shared a fate. The law welcomed ambiguity because ambiguity could be used like a gate. The world now contained a pantheon that was also a house. Children were born with claims that could not be cashed without a witness. Each child held seed and sentence, gift and limit. Each was a demigod, which in this telling means a person born of the vessel of law, and therefore entangled with the law's outcomes. A demigod could not place a foot without entering a treaty with the ground. A demigod could not love without entering a treaty with the future. They lived beneath a canopy whose light made promises that human bodies could not always keep. The first great sorrow grows from a knight that learned to hold a knife. Long before dawn, when bells were sleeping in their towers, a compact was carried out by hands that did not boast. A fragment of the sealed death was borrowed and pressed into tools that stiffened the air they entered. The blades sought a golden heir whose life had been spent like a blessing on festivals and on treaties. Godwyn the Golden was that heir. He was the son who shook hands with dragons and taught them a gentler vocabulary. He anchored fear by looking at it until it named itself. He was beloved because he was safe to stand near. That night he died by arrangement, or as close to death as a soul can pass while the body remains a witness. His spirit dropped into shadows that had no floor. His body became a shape that remembered how to breathe. Godwin's loss was not a single loss. It was a hinge. The law had removed a portion of death to make space for unending life. The night returned a portion of that portion, and the return compromised everything that leaned upon certainty. Roots began to carry a rumor that would later be called Death Root. The chambers of earth that had only held silence now held a misremembered heartbeat. Those who sat near these roots would rise again without the consent of gold. They were not rebels. They were symptoms. A prince who had loved dragons now taught the soil to teach corruption without intent. Those who live in death began to appear. Priests learned a new grammar for resentment. Ranni the witch moved inside this turning with the calm of someone who has counted years like stones near a river. She was a daughter of the House of Moons and a daughter of the red-haired champion. She loved scholarship in a way that changed the shape of rooms. She believed that the law of the cosmos should not be a single voice speaking to everyone. She believed that the moon, which keeps secrets well, ought to be allowed to write a future with cold ink instead of hot decree. She used the same night that killed a brother in soul to unseat herself from the tyranny of flesh. Her body died as a puppet dies when its strings are cut, but her will persisted in a vessel chosen for humility. A doll became an archive. A hand carved of patience carried a ring that did not yet have a finger. This is the first ledger of powers and limits. Power was a currency of runes, but limits were a currency of oaths. A demigod could inherit fire and be unable to warm a room. A demigod could hold an army and be unable to comfort one friend. The Omen twins, born to a queen and a champion who had already retired the crown once, carried horns that marked them for a dignity the capital refused to see. Morgott hid his nature within layers of cloth and within careful phrases. He defended the city that hid him, and his refusal was sharp but abstract, like frost on a window that still admits morning light. Mohg, his twin, walked downward rather than outward. He found an older appetite in the dark, a mother who had no body worth trusting and no pity worth mentioning. He learned to write in blood. He learned to love a brother who had not yet woken. Malenia the Severed grew in a body that contained a patient red rot. It was not merely disease. It was an outer will that had made a home near her pulse, waiting without hurry for the day she would be tired. She swore to keep the infection apart from the world. She trained her sword to be both cut and ceremony. She named herself the blade of another, placing loyalty above everything that could flatter a conqueror. Her twin was Miquella, who disliked borders when they hid cruelty and disliked power when it forgot tenderness. He began to weave a shelter tree that could host the broken without asking them to pay in humiliation. He studied gold and asked it to unalloy itself from pride. Radahn was a general who learned to command the heavens because he loved a small horse that could not carry the size of his success. He learned gravity as a devotion, not as a weapon. He taught the stars to wait, and they obeyed because they admired economy. He wore armor that suggested he could pick up mountains and put them down again without upsetting the nests. He would become a festival because some men become holidays long before they become statues. Rykard, his brother, cultivated a slower disdain, like a scholar who watches a clock he has already taken apart. He called down a serpent that promised to teach him a logic more honest than law. He entered the answer mouth first. Godrick was not a firstborn, nor a second. He was a remembered scion whose bloodline could be drawn on a long sheet with folds. He inherited a seat in a castle that looked out at a coast the weather loved to erase. He felt small inside his inheritance and tried to enlarge himself by collector's means. He took from others what he believed the law had refused him, assembling grafted strength into a kind of choir that could not sing. He called himself Demigod with a voice that trembled when no one listened, then trembled louder when someone did. His tragedy is not that he was a thief. His tragedy is that he never believed that a quiet strength could remain his own. Before the catastrophe that split the law into disputing siblings, the House of Moons had shone with a different kind of confidence. Ranni gathered students like a mother collects careful objects that remind her of each child's first day. She taught the elegance of circles. She measured ambition by how often it returned to humility. Radahn, when he belonged to the academy, repaired what others had broken and learned to describe forgiveness like a technique for joining without hiding the fracture. When he left to stand, beside Marika, the academy kept his absence on the shelves, dusting it lightly. After the law broke, the academy would keep only fragments. An egg that guarded its silence, a woman who remembered loving a man who became a theory. The shattering arrived in the manner of a vase falling in a place where everyone pretends not to hear. No single hand is named because hands are not honest in such matters. The Elden Ring ceased to be a ring. The runes that had once harmonized now argued like lawyers who had lost the minutes of a meeting. The boughs of the Erd tree did not dim, but they acquired a sound like old glass in wind. Each demigod held a great rune because the law needed them to, and because inheritance without proof becomes a rumor. Their wars were not wars of conquest in the cheap sense. They were attempts to assemble law from cousins. They failed. The lands learned to live with failure as a season. Godwyn's death, which had been a singular pivot, now became a field's worth of symptoms. Below, in galleries hewn by animals who never saw sunlight, roots flowered with a memory of him that could not be contained. A dragon called Fortisax had loved him with the kind of love that does not fear being named. Fortisax fought the corruption with a temperate lightning that did not despise what it struck. The struggle did not finish. It grew tired. Above, priests divided into those who believed that corruption could be shamed into retreat, and those who believed shame had never opened a door. Scholars wrote in the margins of liturgy when they meant to write in the text. Ranni's plot became a lineage of withdrawal. She chose a starless path beneath a moon that gives without drama. She rejected an audience with fingers that talk in signs, and she rejected a throne that requires more promises than a life can supply. Her refusal was not petulance. It was the kind of refusal a painter makes when a commission requires flattery. She kept companions whose loyalties were honest because they were particular. A wolf who remembered oaths became her sword. A mimic of men became her mirror. A servant with a face like carved resolve became her daily reminder that dignity can make poverty into a shelter. She held a ring that would not yet be worn because she had not yet finished making herself small enough to wear it. Morgott chose custody over coronation. He stood at the outer gates of the capital and at the inner doors of its traditions. He prevented entry to those who came with claims but without patience. He did not seek praise, he sought delay. Delay in his theology was the cousin of mercy. If the city could rest a little longer beneath the light, then the arguments outside might cool. He fought with a staff that unrolled like a scroll and with an art that refused pageantry. He called himself a king in a tone that implied apology. He would later become an obstacle. For a long time he was a steward. Mohg, by contrast, built a palace where the earth hides, wine, and where pillars seem to grow rather than be placed. He listened for a mother whose form was more invitation than structure. She answered in sensation rather than syllable. He learned a ritual of blood that was not simply cruelty but covenant. He believed he could bring a brother from sleep into a dynasty that would replace golden promises with red ones. His servants believed they had entered a more honest arithmetic, in which what you spill is exactly what you are, and what you receive is exactly what you can name. Above, the capital would call this corruption. Below, it felt like candor. In a slow chamber the size of patience, a cocoon hung and did not move. Malenia's vow was made of a blade and a brother. She authored victories that looked like gardens only because she attacked with precision. The rot inside her waited until a righteous fury woke it. When it woke, it did not argue. It bloomed. In a scarlet field that had once been brown, she fought a general who could hold planets still and still make a child laugh. They met in a place whose name would later smell like iron even in the mouths of children. She could not overcome him by art. She overcame him by consent. She consented to let the rot be visible. The earth did the rest. He lost something that could not be repaired. She lost something she had promised never to show. Both became ruins that others would later visit, as if visiting a shrine. Radahn's dignity persisted even after reason left him. He continued to ride the small horse because love survives better than technical skill. He roamed a coast that had learned to fear its own gulls. Warriors from far spheres traveled to meet him not as enemies but as partakers in a festival that had the shape of a funeral without the finality. They would join battle not to humiliate a legend but to free a legend from an indignity he would not have accepted if he could still write letters. He kept the stars stalled until the day he fell, at which time astronomy resumed with a sigh. The sky moved again. The world rearranged its access like a library reclassifying its holdings. Rykard became a lesson in appetite's metaphors. He allowed an ancient serpent to speak through him because he had long suspected that law is an elaborate excuse. He built a manor where polite society could dine on grudges with silver forks. He told those who came to join him that they were only refusing hypocrisy. They believed him because refusing hypocrisy feels like devotion. The serpent taught him a vocabulary for hunger that was almost liturgical. He promised his followers that the world could be emptied of deceit by swallowing it whole. The promise could not be kept. The meal continued. His great hall became a place where flame did not warm, but argued. Godrick remained in his castle like a collection that had never found a curator. He grafted not only limbs but hope. Each acquired arm felt like a positive answer to a question he had not asked carefully. He decorated himself with the proof of his insecurity. He raised a storm around his walls that served less to keep invaders away than to keep his doubts at home. He failed to notice that some strengths are only visible when they choose not to be performed. He demanded respect that could have been offered freely if he had been willing to be small. He worried about legacy at the expense of kindness. His subjects learned to lower their voices around his name. Miquella shaped a tree as an antidote. He called it a halig tree because holiness is only useful if it can be touched by a tired hand. He studied the alchemy of gold until he believed he could remove from it the impurities of pride and pain. He invited those who had been mutilated by the city's disgust to walk beneath new leaves. He whispered to rot as if he could convince it to change its field of work. He entered a cocoon not to hide, but to become. He believed that sleep could be a craft. He promised a better order by example rather than decree. He planned a future that would not advertise itself. The capital held its light as if holding breath. The Erd tree did not die, but it learned how to refuse. When flames rose, they found a surface that did not accept requests easily. Inside, Marika remained both present and absent in ways that confounded anyone who tried to write a list. Radahn remained both separate and the same in ways that reminded priests of why they dislike paradox. The two fingers endured as oracles that did not enjoy conversation. The Round Table gathered those who believed they could still fix the Voss. The Demigods did not gather. They orbited absence. This is the hidden wanderer era of the tale. It is an era defined by the refrain "not yet." The Tarnished moved across maps alone and in pieces, tracing old roads like veins across a sleeping hand. They looked upwards at a tree that refused to be climbed by stairs. They looked sideways at academies that now taught how to mourn more precisely. They looked downward at roots that whispered a prince's name without consonants. They did not yet meet the demigods in the final rooms where names are confirmed. They met stories about them. They met consequences in towns that had become museums for the living. A ledger of principles continues to write itself here. Destiny is not a simple path, but a tapestry tightly woven from devotion, defect, and decision. Godwyn is devotion to kin turned into a defect of soul that becomes an exhibit in the underworld. Ranni is devotion to autonomy turned into a defect of flesh that becomes a calculated freedom. Morgott is devotion to order turned into a defect of welcome that becomes a gatekeeper's worship. Mohg is devotion to candor turned into a defect of appetite that becomes a dynasty without consent. Malenia is devotion to restraint turned into a defect of containment that becomes an unavoidable disclosure. Miquella is devotion to care turned into a defect of vulnerability that becomes a kidnapping, written like a sacrament. Radahn is devotion to wonder turned into a defect of reason that becomes a legend's humiliation. Rykard is devotion to honesty turned into a defect of hunger that becomes an allegory of a house that eats itself. Godrick is devotion to legacy turned into a defect of dignity that becomes a body without a center. The tragedies were not owned by individuals alone. They were civilizational losses measured in the quality of festivals and in the confidence of bridges. After the rot bloomed, a land of red clay began to sing in a key that frightened travelers. After the Academy's mother withdrew behind Enigma, students learned how to study grief with equipment meant for stars. After the capital's steward refused entry to those who came without permission, pilgrims learned to pray outside gates in voices that would crack. After the Prince of Death seeded knots in the earth, clergy began to practice a diplomacy with shadows. Each demigod's private wound became a public ritual. Each private vow became a geography. The Night of Knives had been the first catastrophe. The shattering of the ring was the second. The long refusal of the tree became the third. Together they formed a triad that historians would later use as a scaffold for summaries that satisfied sober minds and left poets weary. Yet beneath the scaffolding ran a softer cause. It was the fact that the House of Law had become a family. Families do not endure contradiction the way statutes do. A statute can sit beside its opponent on a shelf. A sister can sit beside her opponent at a table only for so long. The runes were precise, the people were not. Inside this discomfort grew both tenderness and treason. Rennala drifted within the academy like a sleepwalker whose hands still arranged dishes. She cradled an egg that kept a future near her heartbeat. She maintained rituals that had lost their audience and echoed in rooms that now remembered empty better than full. Her children moved along lines she could no longer draw straight. Radahn became a military holiday. Rykard became a political confession. Ranni became a lunar manuscript that turned its own pages. She watched them with the hollow pride of someone who built a house that her children learned to leave more expertly than she had planned. Morgott dreamed of a capital without petitions. He wanted a city that could be visited in silence, like a library without a catalog where you find what you need by walking until it looks at you. He saw the tarnished as an interruption before he saw them as a possibility. He preferred guardianship to hospitality. He held his staff and his knives like quills that write receipts. He insisted that entry must be earned because he had paid so much to belong to a place that did not want him. When he slept sitting up. Mohg planned a coronation that required intimacy with a sleeper. He believed that a brother could be persuaded to accept a title by being given a new vocabulary for belonging. He believed that blood is a better grammar for loyalty than light. He spoke to a cocoon as if it could hear. He arranged candles in a geometry that soothed him. He made himself into a priest of a mother whose ceremonies hurt less when he named them. He brought acolytes into the habit of believing that red is honest. Above, this would be called madness. Below, it was consistency. Malenia wandered with a sword that had become a promise. She wore a prosthesis like a memory of an accident firmly accepted. She met champions who wanted to see whether their names would grow if they stood near hers. She wanted only a road that did not force her to choose between grace and exposure. She loved her brother with a devotion that was not theatrical. She sought him as a gardener seeks a lost tool that had once fit the hand perfectly. When she closed her eyes, she saw leaves turning slowly in a light that did not belong to the Erd tree. She believed that discipline could persuade rot to wait forever. She was wrong in that, but she remained beautiful. Miquella's project was a theology of gentle corrections. He looked at the Golden Order not as a tyrant, but as a student who could be tutored toward kindness. He proposed to unalloy gold the way a craftsman unalloys a brittle metal to restore its usefulness. He wanted a law that could be touched by children without injury. He wanted a promise that could be kept by the tired. He wanted hospitality as architecture. He treated his own sleep as an offering to the work. He made himself a seed. Others saw a fruit and plucked it. Radahn's festival became a culture. He stood beneath banners that did not flatter him so much as apologized for what was about to be attempted. His mind had been damaged by an enemy that does not negotiate with pride. He kept riding because riding is a better argument than shouting. The warriors who came to face him believed they were writing a necessary ending. They also believed they were standing inside a story larger than their weapons. When he fell, The sky corrected itself. When the sky corrected itself, doors in the earth opened because stars had written the locks. Rykard hosted hunters who came to join his household by committing acts that the city above would call crimes. He framed their missions as liturgy. He framed their vengeance as penitence. He built a spear reliquary for those who doubted that a serpent could be killed without blasphemy. He allowed himself to be eaten so that he could become an argument from within. He thought that if he could inhabit hunger, he could instruct it. He discovered that hunger is more eloquent than teachers. The manor continued to accept guests. Godrick continued his practice of addition. He added trophies to his frame with the hope that the arithmetic would finally produce an identity that did not crumble when the wind changed. He looked across the sea and called it destiny when it was only weather. He looked inward and called it strength when it was only noise. He received visitors with the unease of a clerk pretending to be a judge. He demanded recognition from statues that had not been carved yet. His people learned to smile and not speak. The banners on his towers learned to fade more slowly than courage. Godwyn's underworld continued its slow education of those who wandered too close. A bestial cleric above ground continued to gnash over the problem of death appearing where it had not been licensed. Faith, when faced with anomaly, will sometimes choose fury, sometimes choose repair, and sometimes choose a dogged waiting that cannot be named patience. The lands practiced all three. Some held funerals that did not end. Some held investigations that could not be authorized. Some lit fires near roots and told stories that made children's hair stand up and then relax. The two fingers persisted as oracles who conducted audiences with the confidence of old bureaucracy. They recommended paths to those whom they believed could complete the law's interrupted sentence. They gestured blessings that were meant to feel like inheritance. They proposed that unity could be restored by 5 firm steps. Some believed this. Some believed the steps led only to a mirror. A masked agent gathered secrets because secrets are the currency most often used to purchase outcomes in a time when visible coin has lost its guarantee. He collected clauses, he collected people. Ranni's path ran parallel to these public ceremonies. She moved across hidden sky and hidden snow toward an ending that would not ask the land to kneel. Her doctrine was to replace a close god with a far star. Her device was a ring that cannot be worn by those who do not understand distance as compassion. She kept faith with dead knights and with the friends who refused to exploit the weak places of her plan. She kept her enemies near enough to hear them breathe. She rehearsed her refusal until it sounded like a hymn. She knew that liberation from fate is not the same as abandonment of care. She walked slowly toward a coronation that would be cold and kind. Malenia's doctrine was restraint, and her device was the blade. Miquella's doctrine was unalloyed compassion, and his device was the halig tree and the sleep within it. Morgott's doctrine was stewardship, and his device was the veil he wore over shame. Mohg's doctrine was candor of blood, and his device was a palace carved out of secrecy. Radahn's doctrine was gravity as humility, and his device was a sky held still. Rykard's doctrine was blasphemy as truth-telling, and his device was a serpent's mouth that gives while it consumes. Godrick's doctrine was accumulation disguised as inheritance, and his device was a collection of limbs that could not quiet a heart. The city watched this ledger of doctrines and devices as if watching weather. It learned to measure the day by which banners were moved, by which bridges were closed. by which eggs remained uncracked on a shelf that pretended not to shiver. Saints in outlying churches kept candles burning that were never lit for the same reason twice. Soldiers on old roads learned to keep their boots in a state of readiness their superiors could admire. Farmers looked at the tree before looking at the soil. Hunters tied their hair with the care of persons attending a wedding. The land believed and doubted at the same time. There is a limit to how long an age can stay inside a prelude. The long refrain not yet teaches endurance and teaches resentment in equal measures. It provides a stable time in which to heal and a dangerous time in which to plan. The demigods were now more than people. They were constellations by which anxious travelers set their course. They were also lighthouses that indicated rocks rather than harbors. Their tragic fates were not finished, only rehearsed. Each figure stood at the threshold of an encounter that would allow history to finish its sentence, whether in praise or in mourning. Godwin's fate pressed outward through root and legend until even cities on cliffs felt their cellars breathe. He did not rise to claim his name. He let tendrils carry it for him. There are eras when the kindest thing a prince can do is fail to return. Ranni's fate waited at an altar where the cold moon could be asked to sign a contract. She offered a country a different kind of hope, the kind that removes fate rather than refines it. Morgott's fate stood with him at the inner gate and whispered that dignity sometimes chooses a final stand when success has already left the room. Mohg's fate hung over a cocoon like a benediction written in the wrong ink. Malenia's fate advanced with every careful step taken in a corridor of a withered tree she had not planted. Miquella's fate coiled in dreams he had curated for another kind of mourning. Radahn's fate crossed swords with memory and asked to be released from a festival that would otherwise repeat forever. Rykard's fate continued to insist that swallowing is a form of understanding. Godrick's fate pounded on his own door and asked to be let out. All of these fates prepare the hinge on which the second part of this story will turn. The tarnished move closer to rooms where the door latch is a choice with too many hands on it. The Erdtree's refusal will be addressed by flames that learn to kneel only to leap higher. The capital's steward will explain his kindness by refusing it. The Academy's mother will cradle the symbol of a future until someone decides to use it. The underworld will pulse in time with a dragon's fading anger. A dynasty of blood will propose a crown made of hunger. A moon will offer distance as a cure. A halig tree will promise shade to a child whose eyes have not yet opened. The lands between hold their breath. The runes wait for sentences that have not yet found their verbs. The figures stand in rooms that feel like doors. The law keeps its shape with visible effort. The light remembers is only a step from the light forgets. The story walks from cosmic scale to intimate scenes and back again, like a tide that keeps time for an age that requires rhythm more than it requires certainty. The demigods are ready to meet what comes. The listener is ready to hear what cannot be soothed. The inevitability is not a hammer. It is a slow river that never forgets its path. Not yet. Soon, threads of fate already drawn through quiet hands. The hinge opens softly. Rooms that had felt like antechambers decide they were always courts. The tarnished steps through patience and arrives where names are confirmed by consequence. The demigods, each carrying their own device and doctrine, stand at the edges of their fates. The land does not shout. It waits for sentences to complete. It waits for vows to become outcomes. It waits for love to accept its price. Storms gather over the castle that keeps its banners even when the sea insists on taking them down. Godrick receives visitors with the uneasy bravado of a collector who knows his museum is made of borrowed fragments. He calls strength by the names of others. He fastens trophies to a body that was asking to be believed rather than expanded. In the great hall where his lineage still echoes like a favor asked too often, he tries to prove a bloodline by volume. The tarnished comes as weather comes, patient and impersonal, and the lightning of consequence introduces humility to a man who had stitched himself out of borrowed courage. When the uproar quiets, the courtyard feels wider. Servants lift their eyes without permission. The sea heaves and settles. A great rune passes from inheritance by noise to inheritance by use, and the castle learns to speak in a lower voice. Beyond the cliffs, the academy keeps circles within circles, and the mother of the school holds an egg as if holding dawn. Rennala has lost a consort to a mystery that polite books refuse to print. She continues to orchestrate a ritual of rebirth for students who ask for a second attempt at being themselves. She does not seek conquest. She keeps a private cathedral of memory, and she lets those who come to challenge her leave with something gentler than victory. When the tarnished enters her moonlit library, the fight proceeds like a debate that never raises its voice. Glass hums, pages turn, a cradle of light rocks slowly while reason rearranges itself. When quiet returns, she remains, not fallen but changed, a queen of continuance who blesses the uncertain and keeps the door unbarred for those who need another start. Her great rune becomes a sympathy rather than a scepter, and the academy resumes its careful breathing. Far to the east, red earth holds its breath around a general who once taught planets how to hesitate. Radahn wanders with a mind damaged by an old pestilence, and with a heart still loyal to a small horse whose trust anchored a giant. A festival is declared in the language of drums and horns, not to mock a legend, but to escort him toward a rest he could not choose for himself. Banners lift. Cannons speak. Fighters enter the sand with reverence disguised as bravado. The general welcomes them as nature welcomes a storm it does not resent. The struggle is a chorus, not a punishment. When at last the sand stops remembering every step, the stars remember how to move. They fall in a single decisive gesture that opens stone like a book. A path into an old city appears where there had been only rumor. Songs that night are sung softly. A small horse is led away with tenderness. The sky resumes its duty, and a great rune rings like a bell that marks the end of a long watch. Beneath volcano stone, in a manner that discovered how to be courteous about vengeance, Rykard completes his long argument with appetite. He has become both priest and parishioner to a serpent that promises truth as a meal. Guests attend ceremonies that replace confession with devouring and pledge their offenses to the furnace. The tarnished arrives not as a scold, but as a counter-argument written in steel. A spear fashioned for this one debate waits where brave hands can find it. The hall fills with heat and a roaring that explains itself by volume, yet even there a quieter logic persists. When monster and lord are parted, what remains is smaller and more honest. The portraits on the walls keep staring, but their certainty has learned how to blush. A great rune is taken up by someone who will not confuse hunger with candor, and the manor's liturgy folds itself like a garment that has been worn once too often. The capital presents itself like an illuminated manuscript that has survived several fires. Its outer walls remember the hand that wrote them, and the inner sanctum remembers the day the scribe refused to continue. Morgott stands in the breach between symbol and city. He has chosen stewardship over sympathy, and he wears his refusal like a vestment. When the tarnished comes to the gate, he speaks not in words, but in the movement of a staff that has learned to write law on air. He bears horns that were hidden to make others comfortable, and in that truth his dignity is complete. The battle is not a carnival. It is a closing ceremony for a long custodianship. When he is gone, the city is poorer by one honest sentinel. The doors stand open with an air of apology, and a great rune leaves the hand of a gatekeeper to rest in the palm of a traveler who knows what it costs to hold a threshold. The palace beneath the earth does not ask for announcements. It waits in twilight where candles look like veins. Mohg officiates in a language that treats blood as both ink and oath. He has gathered acolytes who desire a world where appetite does not beg for pardon. In the deepest chamber, a cocoon hangs with a boy sleeping inside. A boy who once promised to unalloy pride from law and make gold kinder, who now lies held by a brother's ambition and a mother without a form. Mohg speaks to the silk as if it could answer, and it answers only by remaining. The rite that follows is precise and wrong. The tarnished refuses the script and introduces mercy as a weapon that cuts cleanly. When silence takes the hall, the candles learn how to flicker like ordinary fire. The cocoon keeps its secret. Attendants leave with the slow shame of those who admired conviction more than wisdom. A great rune changes hands, and the dynasty that could not begin returns to the mathematics of dust. In a rot-blown land where flowers are too honest to hide their cruelty, Malenia continues her pilgrimage of restraint. She seeks a brother who sleeps in a dream he chose as a workshop. She gathers followers who mistake her quiet for permission. She meets a veteran whose scars have learned to be patient. Their contest is a conversation conducted in edges and breath. When she yields to the bloom that her discipline had caged, the earth turns scarlet and learns how to sing in a frightening key. The veteran endures and the flower withers back to stem. She kneels because she is still a servant before she is a legend. A great rune passes from a saint of restraint to a traveler who must reconcile kindness with necessity. The wind continues across red fields and carries away the sound of a name that is now a prayer more than a threat. Parallel to these rooms, in corridors beneath roots where echoes grow teeth, Godwin's fate keeps writing itself in other people. Those who dwell near his corruption wake without breath and continue with a dignity that frightens law more than soldiers. A bestial cleric gnashes against the presence of death that was not licensed and hunts the rumor like a personal oath. A knight who carries sorrow like an emblem seeks a dragon who loved a prince and still refuses to hate the world that stole him. A consort who prefers truth to triumph stands watch over a bed where sleep is almost healing. Together they form a liturgy of repair in a place that aches. No one announces a victory. The earth remembers a heart that was forced to teach decay. The lessons are slow and incomplete. That is enough for a while. The Erd tree's refusal persists like a polite but final letter returned unopened. The door will not admit flame that listens to ordinary prayers. A black blade waits in a temple where time looks at itself without blinking. Malekith, the old warden of stolen death, guards the last portion of the truth that made immortality possible. He is not a demigod, and yet his watch touches every demigod's fate. When his charge is broken, a flame that persuades even a golden tree to accept transformation becomes available. It is not vengeance. It is a correction that admits cost. The path steepens. Ash falls like dry snow. The capital turns to gray lace. At the summit, where a great forge rings with old decisions, the choice to set a new fire answers centuries of abundance and scarcity. The Erd tree yields with a sound like a cathedral, deciding during a storm to open its doors to strangers. Light spills. The air tastes like iron and forgiveness. Beyond the open boughs stands the figure who is both partner and principal. Radahn, red-haired and radiant with contradiction, receives refusal as a final embrace. When his art of mending is exhausted, the law that wore him like a glove descends in a shape older than language. The beast of order arrives, and the last argument proceeds in a water of stars. There are endings that keep gold and make it kinder. There are endings that invite a moon to lead a slow caravan into distances where rule is colder and gentler. There are endings that welcome frenzy, dissolve grammar, and call dissolution a cure. These climates are not the demigods' fates. They are the weather in which the last lines of demigod stories are read. Whatever choice is made, the house that gave the law a face remains a set of names carried forward by those who survived them. Morgott's last scene was already written in his posture. He dies as a steward dies when the house chooses change over conscience. He leaves a city that has lost a kind enemy. Pilgrims argue about whether to add his name to litanies. Children hear rumors that the stern king who barred the gate did so because he loved the city more than himself. A great rune freed from a vigil's hands strengthens the wrists of one who must open doors rather than guard them. Mohg's last moment is a broken liturgy. He tried to marry a sleeping brother to a dynasty only he could see. He tried to write a kingdom with a knife that cut both altar and guest. When he is gone, the palace keeps breathing because palaces always do. The cocoon still keeps its sleeper. Servants drift away with the slow shame of those who had mistaken devotion without consent for love. The blood in the halls learns how to dry. His great rune is lifted without ceremony, and the underground returns to silence. Radahn's last moment is an ovation under an emptying sky. He had stood alone against the heavens because he learned to love wisely. He is released from that vigil by a community that chooses courage without envy. Songs almost like lullabies follow the procession. The small horse is led to rest by hands that will not forget. The great rune that remains sounds when used like the memory of silence performed on a battlefield. Rykard's last moment is a lesson in how to lose beautifully. He set himself within a serpent to test a theory about honesty. He discovered he had mistaken a furnace for a chapel. When he is separated from the monster, what remains is smaller and truer. The manor retires some rituals. The long table is set for ordinary meals. Those who sought freedom from hypocrisy learn the longer work of kindness. A great rune changes meaning when held by steadier fingers. Godrick's last moment is a letting go. When the grafted frame no longer impersonates a dynasty, a thin man remains who might have been kind if anyone had taught him how. His great rune goes on to serve those who are not ashamed to say they need it. His tragedy is not villainy, but a failure of courage in the private room where a person decides how large his name must be. Rennala's later years pass within a chapel of study. She lays down the authority to command and keeps the authority to bless. The egg does not crack. It glows as if remembering the sun. She becomes a mother to strangers, and the academy becomes a hospital for minds that admit their own tenderness. Her great rune remains a solace more than a staff, and she teaches by listening. Malenia's later path narrows to the flower she left behind and to the people who read that flower like scripture. Some worship her restraint, some worship her bloom. Few understand that she intended one to guard the other. Her sword remains a parable bright and unboastful. Her great rune enters the hands of one who must reconcile care for a brother with care for a world. Her tragedy is that love made exposure unavoidable, and yet the exposure was itself an act of love. Miquella's later fate is a chamber of quiet. He does not wake under the palace. He does not answer when called. He remains a promise in silk, and then the promise passes into paths that avoid the capital's roads. Some speak of a realm of shadow where his steps are followed by many, drawn by a grace that feels like kindness from far away. Some speak of a vow to relinquish even the notion of being an answer. The details remain veiled. What can be said without trespass is that his doctrine of gentleness outlives his sleep. Ranni's later path is the only one that can be called tender without irony. If invited, she guides the age into a long journey away from heat that burns zeal more often than it warms wisdom. She does not punish. She does not indulge. She replaces proximity with patience and rule with stewardship from a distance that does not smother. Companions are honored in private. A wolf is remembered without fanfare. A mimic accepts that being a mirror can be a vocation. A faithful servant with a sad, carved face is allowed to rest. Her great rune, when it matters, is not a seal of domination, but an emblem of consent. Godwyn's later presence spreads as folklore. Villages speak his name under their breath when the soil moves near old graves. Clergy learn new prayers that admit the world is stranger than old teachers allowed. Those who live in death walk with other citizens when the sun is gentle and keep to lanes of shade when stairs grow sharp. A coexistence develops not by decree but by practice. The prince remains a lesson in how a single night can write centuries. His tragedy is shared and therefore bearable. The family at the center splits into memory and myth. Marika remains a question with several credible answers. Radahn remains the same question with a different emphasis. Their children become the stories a land tells to itself when deciding how to forgive. The great runes pass into hands that know how to use tools without needing to inherit titles. The age that follows is named by the choice made at the end of a long road. The demigods become adjectives rather than rulers. The cost they paid becomes a curriculum. Across the map, small consequences make a choir. Roads grow safer where festivals once demanded too much courage. Libraries repair their roofs. Red fields find grasses that dare to grow. Volcano stone cools to a temperature that permits sleep. City gates swing easier. Caves below ground return to being caverns that hold up the earth. New altars are built with lower steps for the tired. Old weapons are retired without pageantry. The world learns to live with the memory of very large people by improving small kindnesses. Not every loss is redeemed. Some towns remain empty because laughter cannot be taught to walls. Some names are carved into sword hilts and then lost when the hilts are replaced. Some promises are kept by people who receive no thanks because no one remembers the danger that was avoided. Still, the quiet work that follows a shattering continues. Children are shown stars that move again. Farmers teach the ground to trust plows where meteors once wrote their own language. Traders learn routes that respect the wounds of old bridges. The calendar forgets a few battle anniversaries and adds harvest fairs. The demigods, in their tragic variety, have left a curriculum. Godrick teaches that legacy without humility becomes costume. Rykard teaches that intellect without kindness recruits monsters. Radahn teaches that wonder carried past endurance turns into need. Ranni teaches that love that lingers can be reoriented toward care. Morgott teaches that stewardship without welcome becomes a locked door that keeps friends out. Mohg teaches that devotion without consent becomes a sacrament of harm. Malenia teaches that restraint is a vow that costs blood, and that love can survive without spectacle. Miquella teaches that gentleness is more radical than correction. Ranni teaches that distance used without cruelty can protect tenderness. Godwin teaches that the world bends when death is mishandled and that repair is slow work. These fates do not end as songs promise. There is no clean ledger where the good are rewarded and the proud are always unmasked before a cheering crowd. There is a careful recalibration. The world keeps some of their tools and learns to set aside their wounds. The Erd tree continues to stand. Its gold is not quite the same gold. Its shade feels different at noon. Birds sing in branches that once only rang with proclamations. The night brings a moon that does not insist. In the far reaches, the halig tree continues to host those who refuse to be defined by injuries they did not choose. The rot in the world learns to be less proud. Serpents in old halls grow quieter. The academies reframe their teaching with more room for failure that does not destroy. The capital opens archives that had never been carefully catalogued, and a few secrets lose the glamour that kept them dangerous. Festivals are redesigned with better exits and kinder speeches. Old runes are taught as grammar rather than destiny. Scholars argue as they must about dates. Priests debate how loudly the outer powers still speak. Soldiers drill more softly and learn to listen when traders describe bandits who sound too organized. The two fingers continue their precise gestures, but fewer look to them for comfort. The hands that matter in the next age belong to farmers, to smiths, to midwives, to teachers, to the quiet ranger who knows where old paths do not break ankles. The language of the age becomes domestic without becoming dull, yet the tapestry keeps darker threads. In catacombs, a second heartbeat can be felt on certain nights. In churches, a hymn about a scarlet flower is sung with more fervor than is wise. In polite houses, portraits of a snake are kept behind curtains because relatives cannot agree whether to keep them visible. In outland taverns, stories of a festival under a ruined sky are told with tears that do not embarrass anyone. In lonely towers, a few scholars still argue that the moon is kinder than it looks, or else too kind, and that the difference matters. The story closes where it began, at the border between an intention from far away and the tender stubbornness of those who must live beneath it. The greater will remains what it was, a principle that found a voice through a tree and a queen. The lands between remain what they are, a place where people carry water, bake bread, mend shoes, bury their dead, and teach their children songs about large figures who tried to make sense of fear with courage. The demigods step off the stage, some into statues, some into rumors, some into the quiet grammar of how a people now behaves. If a moonlit caravan departs the old law and wanders for 1,000 years among unfamiliar constellations, the calm will be cool and the hope will be slow. If a restored golden law holds after long repairs, its heat will have learned to respect the skin. If another frenzy ever tempts tired hearts, it will be met quickly by hands that remember how much was already saved by gentler means. These are climates, not cages. People beneath them still choose, still wake, still weep when needed, still laugh when allowed, still forgive when asked correctly. At the end, the listener stands on a high place where ash has settled and the light is honest about its limits. The demigods lie quiet in their various triumphs and failures. The tree continues to glow. The sky continues to move. Roots carry whispers that will take generations to forget. A few flowers, red and pale, open and close in the wind without asking approval. The future approaches with the courtesy of a guest who does not overstay. The age that follows is slower and less certain and better. Not yet becomes now. Now becomes memory. Memory becomes a guide. The long story of a house that tried to live as law settles into soil. The listener rests. The night holds steady. Threads of fate lie in careful lines across a table that has seen more than one age of hands.